right, this lecture is for Module 4, which corresponds to Chapter 11, written by Timothy Rommen. The subject of the day is music of the Caribbean. Now, a great deal of Chapter 11 deals with the relationship between music and identity. You'll see how musical genres and practices are central to the ways in which social groups define themselves and those around them, both from positions of power and from the margins. The way in which musical practice intersects with ideas about identity has everything to do with power, race, class, and gender, which in turn are determined by the colonial context. Throughout Chapter 11, music intersects with these themes in several ways. Music that is closely associated with centers of power, which in this case is to say European-derived aesthetic preferences and contexts, is considered refined art music or high culture. Music that is associated with marginal social groups, usually poor, ethnically othered groups, is considered lowbrow, vulgar, uncivilized, etc. One of Rommen's working assumptions, and it is not too much of a stretch to say that there is scholarly consensus within ethnomusicology around this point, is that these perceptions of high and low cultural status stem more from prevailing power relationships than they do from the actual character of the music itself. These power relationships and the broadly circulating assumptions that accrue to ideas of race are all at least partially determined by the colonial context. The people who seize or inherit a position of power through the deeply unequal experience of colonialism got to define not only their own identities, but also those of the people who surrounded them. They created both the lines of social division and the discourses that characterized each of the groups separated by these lines. These perspectives had a de facto authority because they were backed up by the constant threat of violence, and because the group that created them had the sole access to public discourse. Thus, the colonial encounter shaped the ways in which people thought about race and identity in ways that have persisted and will continue to persist long after the end of the official colonial period. The categories that define social distinction, black, white, highbrow, lowbrow, refined, uncivilized, which were put in place to buttress the power of a specific social group, have long outlasted the institutions they were created to support, and will continue to help maintain residual power imbalances along race, class, and gender lines for years to come. In this context, the fight for radio airtime, for official recognition, for freedom of expression can be interpreted as efforts to correct this skewed perspective. Musical works that creatively leverage instruments, linguistic practices, and formal dimensions associated with marginalized social groups can often be interpreted as specifically political acts aimed at counteracting prevailing discourses of value. This relation between music, race, nation, and power plays out differently in different scenarios. One pattern that can be seen with various styles discussed in Chapter 11 is rejection at home, acceptance abroad, and then reconsideration at home. A musical genre or style associated with a marginalized social group is maligned and heavily stigmatized not only by provincial or colonial authorities, but also by a multi-ethnic local middle class doing its best to align itself with power, which usually means adopting European-derived aesthetics and embracing the high-low distinctions offered by official voices. Later, this maligned musical style gains acceptance in metropolitan centers outside the country or island of origin, such as in New York City, Paris, or London. And suddenly, the very people who had for years condemned this style now embrace it as a proud emblem of their cultural identity. This process can occur via international fads or during moments of heightened national sentiment at home, such as during wars or independence movements. Versions of this process occurred with tango, rumba, calypso, and many other styles. The opening vignette of this chapter uses a vivid description of a festival dedicated to rake and scrape music to ruminate on some of the chapter's central themes. This style reflects diasporic and transnational processes and connections. It is also made meaningful in ways that are also fundamentally local. So what is rake and scrape? It is the traditional music of the Bahamas, and it's usually for accordion, goat skin drum, and carpenter's saw. It is defined by its signature rhythmic pattern, which we will listen to in a minute, and traditionally accompanied something called quadrille dancing, but dance contexts are uncommon today. This style has influenced a great deal of popular music in the Bahamas. Let's take a little break to listen to the first example of Rake and Scrape. This is Listening Guide 11.1, Times Table by Ophi and the Websites. Their rendition of Times Table illustrates the principal musical characteristics of Rake and Scrape. I just want to go over some of these because there are musical terms that if you're not musically trained, you may not understand in these study guides. So it talks about listening to the rhythm played on the saw, which consists of a series of successive 16th notes with an accent placed on the third 16th note of each beat. If you don't know how to read music, this makes no sense. So what that is a beat is a steady pulse, right, in music. And what they mean by 16th note is there's four little notes in each beat. So da 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 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 like that. And the rhythm played on the saw is going to be on the third third note of each beat. 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4. The accent pattern emphasizes the and of each beat in each measure. So if we count 1 2 1 2 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 1 and a 2 and a. That's basically what that means. If you listen carefully, you can also hear that the saw player is bending and releasing the saw to get different timbral effects, so higher and lower sounds. Notice too the way that the drummer interacts with the saw player. During the first phrase, there are 4 measures per phrase. The drummer generally executes a single low-pitched stroke on the and of the second beat of measures 2 and 4. The next phrase finds the drummer playing an extended fill that eventually culminates on the second beat of measure 8. This pattern is, of course, varied from time to time in the course of improvisation, but the variations are effective and interesting thanks in large part to the fact that the general structure is firmly in place. Okay, what does that mean? Let's see. We have the drummer is just playing a low note on the and on every other measure. So and then and again. Okay. Finally, notice the short melodic phrases. They're about 4 measures long, which are put together into a verse form, 6 phrases of 4 measures each, paired together to create a 3-part structure, A-B-A. The only exception to this pattern is at the very beginning when the A section is played once as an introduction and then repeated as the first section of the A-B-A. Okay, well, here we go. So the saw pattern is here in little X's. Here, so the little X is, we're just going through 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4, and then what is this alternate? Okay, If at any time these listening guides go over your head, come hang out with me at an office hour and we'll look at it together and listen together. For these videos, I can't always play the audio. I'm afraid to listen to too much of it because of the copyright issue. So let's see if I can open this here. Okay. Okay. Da, 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 da. Can you hear that? Try again. So an accent would be like a louder note. That is all that I'm comfortable playing. It might still mute me. I apologize for that. Okay. And then as far as this form, it will probably make more sense as you listen to the music and follow along this guide. We have a form of an intro and then first verse, and you can see the first verse. We have musical material introduced, and then the B means something different, a new idea, and then a return of the first idea, and then a second verse, and then a third. So if you'd like to hit pause, there's some good advice in these listening guides. This one doesn't have that, but generally when you're listening to a piece of music, you should listen a few times to it, and the first time just generally to get an idea of how the song goes, and then you can start to hone in your listening and pay attention to the different elements, like the instrument that's playing at certain time stamps and so on, and try to do it a few times so that you start to gain an understanding of what's happening in there. So you can hit pause here and then come back to the slides when you're done checking out the music. There should be a link in Blackboard on the same page as this video. Okay, all right, but for now let's move on to learning about Cat Island, which is a small island in the Bahamas. You can see that on the map here. It is has a relatively small population of about 1,600 people, and it's one of what's called the Family Islands. And why am I telling you about Cat Island? Well, it is the center for rake and scrape and straw work. This is sort of where everything happens as far as this musical style. And it is also the center for the practice of obeya, which is a folk belief and practice derived from African models. And what happens with people from Cat Island, the government holds up these areas up as great repositories of distinctly Bahamian traditions, but ironically, these are exactly the areas to which the government devotes the least attention and investment in the Bahamas. So most people leave the island to find employment when they become working age, and those who can return for the Rake and Scrape festival. This is the site for the production of identity and instantiation of community. Events like this festival bring large numbers of people together, and communities are musically instantiated. It is this music's distinguishing features and its way of engaging a public with specific ties to the Bahamas and to Cat Island that makes it a local tradition. Okay, let's talk about Rake and Scrape as transnational music. So, Pan-Caribbean currents and transnational shared culture, what that means is the Caribbean is a site of transnational activity. The broader Caribbean rhythmic patterns are used, interpreted and negotiated in the local context. So we have use of accordion, the basic harmonic conception, and quadrille dancing that reflect colonial heritage, but it's also improvisatory. There's call and response interaction between the melody and the goatskin drum that point toward African influence approach. Ancient Man is an innovative, popular rake and scrape performer, and he incorporates key elements of rake and scrape into a sound that includes more modern instruments like drum kit, bass guitar, and keyboard. He draws in elements of other African diasporic musical styles as well. He appears on stage with a scarf that bears the word Kuumba, which is the 6th day of Kwanzaa and means creativity. He wears Rastafari colors, yellow, red, green, and black. And by wearing this scarf, Ancient Man is simultaneously affirming his affinity for African American cultural symbols and his solidarity with his Caribbean neighbors. Gospel music takes center stage on the 3rd night of the Rake and Scrape Festival. A variety of sacred music traditions are influenced in this festival. This includes anthems, which tie Bahamians to other Protestants throughout the Caribbean, but are sung in a particularly Bahamian way. And the gospel music also includes broader influences such as African American gospel and R&B. Several experiences shared across locations have shaped Caribbean musical life. We have the diaspora, which is the movement of people who often share ethnic or national history from their homeland. This implies an exile that usually precludes the possibility of return. Colonialism, which means a violent encounter of dominance, slavery, indentured servitude, imposition of European laws, languages, religions, and economies. And these vestiges of colonialism are visible in political structures, language, religious life, and forms of ethnic identification at stake in the Caribbean. Syncretism, which relates to the language. There are various Creole and Patois languages used broadly here, and they are regarded through colonial lens. The European languages, for example, are characterized as official or proper or literate, while the Creole, usually African-influenced languages, were regarded as unofficial or oral only or vulgar in some cases. And then there's also religious syncretism. There's Christianity, Voodoo, Santeria, Obeah, Shango, etc. Folk Catholicism, and then Afro-Christian religions like the revival churches in Jamaica. We see in the shared histories of the Caribbean, we have devastation of indigenous populations through forced labor, introduction of European diseases, removal from various locations to centers of production. And there are only very small surviving populations in a few locations because of this. There is a strong influence of African and European-derived musical practices and in Caribbean music. The African-derived influences involve instruments such as lamellophones, drums, shakers, and scrapers, dances, African dances like rumba and bele, and rhythmic concepts such as timelines and clave. There are other more subtle African-derived concepts and practices such as the call and response structure, rhythmic complexity like syncopation, interlocking parts, and 3+3+2 patterns, and cellular construction like a cyclical open-ended form based on an ostinato. The Caribbean also has European-derived musical practices, instruments such as strings, winds, brass, piano, and accordion, dance forms like the waltz, the mazurka, and the quadrille, and verse forms like the copla and the decima. There are actually also East Indian influences in Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname, and instruments from those traditions like the dholak, the dantal, and the harmonium. And principal Native American influence is the maraca. Little else survived the colonial encounter in this area, but the maraca is still part of the Caribbean musical influence. And then, of course, there is powerful influence from the United States in the Caribbean. Their cultural influence was exerted through mass media. They maintain a physical presence via military intervention. And of course, we see that in Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Trinidad, and Grenada. Lastly, for this portion of the lecture, let's talk a little bit about the themes we'll see in Caribbean music. There are 4 principal themes that organize all the case studies or the musical examples for this chapter. Number 1 are patterns of musical reception. 2, questions of identity. Class and cultural politics is 3rd. And then the influence and transnationalism that comes with tourism and travel.